to see if there are any traits of autistic persons that I have in common with them. The doctor was not an autism expert. At this time, she referred me to another doctor to diagnose learning conditions that I have. The second doctor diagnosed me as having those learning disabilities. But interestingly, I remember that the two doctors had a heated conversation disagreeing over whether I had autism. I shared with my grandmother, a former college professor, that one of the doctors raised to me the topic of autism, and my grandmother started researching about the condition. In her research, my grandmother learned about the Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, I believe they are located, which is a center to assist young persons with developmental disabilities and their families. But at that time, at the age of 25, upon graduating, I was too old to receive support services from Kennedy Krieger. Based on my late self-diagnosis of being on the autism spectrum, I am a strong proponent of early diagnosis and treatment of autism. Incidentally, 15 years later, I would do work directly on behalf of Kennedy Krieger. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you saw with the diagnostic DSM criteria for autism, it's very kind of negative. And I actually cringe when I see it's in the name of the manual is mental disorders, because it kind of conveys that I have to conform to the normal order. And I don't really like that. And so I'm going to accentuate some of the positives that autistic people contribute. People on the autism spectrum typically like to perform detailed and repetitive work. They typically are good at this work. We have autistic persons have a tendency to use higher tier vocabulary when speaking, which can make conversations kind of stilted and hard to convey and talk. People on the autism spectrum typically are literal thinkers. People on the autism spectrum typically are known for working diligently. And we are known for our honesty. But the caveat is autism, like many conditions, is a wide spectrum. Therefore, an autistic person might not exhibit all these traits listed above. I mention these characteristics so that you can learn about some of the strengths and challenges that autistic persons face. I myself often use higher tier vocabulary when speaking, although I'm very frank in the number of words I say. When I attended college, I started to use, and some have said too much, readability scores in Microsoft Office to make my writing clearer. Through working, I've learned to make my professional writing more concise. Next slide, please. So here's a list of best practices that I've come up with that are both specific to helping AU students with disabilities, those that are on the autism spectrum, and those who are disabled. Most of you who are faculty probably do this already. Be in touch with ASAC, Academic Support Center, regarding accommodations for students and making sure that they are met. Eliminate in the classroom any sensory distractions, be it auditory or visual, as autistic persons are usually sensitive to bright lighting and loud noise. I too am sensitive to light and prefer to work in environments with subdued lighting. But I'm mindful that most people need and like to work with ample lighting. Therefore, when I was working alone in my office over the summer, I would turn off the lights over my desk, but left the lights in the front of the room where people entered. Such an approach and compromise could be used in the classrooms to facilitate learning for both autistic and non-autistic persons. if you cannot remove or fix any sensory distractions, please call 2Fix, the campus office, and I can provide that number, or you can email them. Alternatively, your department's admin can contact 2Fix, which can also address physical barriers in a classroom. To promote inclusive learning, use plain language or less complex. I think we missed a slide. Okay, thank you. To promote inclusive learning, use plain language or less complex words when speaking or writing to introduce new concepts and course material. I can give you a couple of examples, and they come from plainlanguage.gov. They recommend replacing accurate with correct, avoid using address and replace it with discuss, and substitute helpful for advantageous. So it might be that plain language in general are not longer words, shorter words. My former employer, the Association of University Centers of Disabilities, AUCD, no relation to AU, brought to my attention plain language and the importance of using it to promote inclusive learning, as in people with different learning abilities and styles all coming to like a certain level and going from that to an understanding of a subject. I recognize that plain language can be subjective, as I might see a word as being plain language, but another person might not. Moreover, certain technical terms and words do not have equivalent terms and words. Second point, plain language presents a quandary, or should I say a problem for me, in that because of my tendency to use higher tier language. Moreover, because of my disability in writing expression, it takes me a few more words to articulate my thoughts in written form. Nonetheless, I tried to use plain language words when possible to promote clear understanding and inclusive learning. Next slide, please. So here's some other best practices I recommend. And faculty are probably doing this, but I recommend using different approaches, such as writing assignments and oral presentations to evaluate student academic performance to give a more holistic, balanced, and comprehensive assessment. In contrast, depending too heavily on one type of assessment, say academic papers, can put a student with a writing disability at a disadvantage. I also recommend putting high-achieving students, selecting them for TA assignments, and putting students in touch with your contacts to work on projects, paid jobs, and internships. That is very important. When I was a student, I had very good grades upon graduating, but I did not have the work experience to be a marketable job candidate after graduating. I would also recommend that you encourage students to visit the AU's Career Center and website to learn about jobs and careers related to their majors and minors. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a list of local and national agencies that have helped me personally. The first organization, Jewish Social Service Agency, they have offices in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. They provide employment, they offer employment specialists to assist job candidates with disabilities in finding jobs, helping the job candidates during the job application process, developing their interview skills, and retaining employment. The Organization for Autism Research, located in Arlington, Virginia, is a national organization that advocates for employment of autistic persons. a topic very dear to my heart. Higher Autism's website has a database of job announcements of companies making outreach to the autistic community. Higher Autism helped me with developing my interview skills when I was searching for a job. Ask Jan is another great resource. Oh, can we go back, please? Is another great resource, and that stands for Job Application Process. It's a website, it's a comprehensive website with resources to assist disabled job seekers regarding accommodations in the job application process and on the job. People on the Jan website can anonymously submit questions regarding these matters to the site and receive answers. Besides providing employment support services, the Howard County Autistic Society runs social and fitness events for autistic persons and their families. Last but not least is the Association of University Centers on Disability, AUCD, which I am forever grateful to for giving me my first opportunity in consistent employment 13 years after I graduated from college. Moreover, AUCD taught me valuable skills such as plain language to assist persons with disabilities. This is an association of centers at universities across the US and its territories engaged in pioneering research on developmental disabilities, including autism. The nearest AUCD center to AU is Georgetown University Center for Excellence and Developmental Disabilities. And because of my passion in promoting disability inclusion in higher education, that's what has brought me here today. And that concludes my part of the presentation.
Can we go back to, I'll share my screen.
Okay.
Is there a way to make sure people can see my face in case they need a lip read?
Yes, working on that. Perfect.
Thank you. Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Caitlin, can you give me a thumbs up since I can't see anyone else?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Great. So this is Tanya speaking again. We are dropping a link to my Access copy in the chat. An Access copy, as a reminder, is the entirety of my remarks typed up so that you can read along if that would be helpful. You can also use the QR code again that you can see right now that you can scan with your phone or another device to also get to the Access copy. In the Access copy, you'll also find a link to the Google Doc again, where we are collecting questions for the Q&A. So on this slide, you can see my name, Tanya Aho, my email address, aho@american.edu, and my affiliation, the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies, as well as the link and QR code to my Access copy. I'm a white, middle-aged person with short curly hair, and I'm wearing a blue sweater, and I'm sitting at my desk in my office and the Sports Center Annex 162. In the background, you can see framed posters on the wall and part of a bookshelf. You might also notice that the overhead lights are off and that instead I use floor and table lamps that give off softer light. I'm not wearing a mask since I'm alone in my office, which is also why I am zooming into this session instead of attending in person, because masks were not required at the conference. So if you wanted to find me in person, you might have a hard time. Let me show you this new campus map of accessible paths, which is the next slide. Dark blue buildings are barrier-free, of which there are about 20 to 26, depending on how you count interconnected buildings. But buildings with some access barriers or buildings that are not accessible at all are East Quad Building, Hearst, Asbury, Osborne, McCabe, Gray, Roper, Clark, Watkins, Hamilton, Jack Child, Rockwood, the Media Production Center, the President's Office, and the Child Development Center. On the map, accessible paths are marked with red dotted lines that show that most buildings can be reached through accessible paths somehow, even though it oftentimes means taking significant detours, but some buildings, such as mine, cannot be reached through accessible paths at all. To find my office, you would have to venture from the quad past the sports center, either looping far around the dorms and moving in the street, down a very steep hill through the amphitheater with several steps, or down several flights of stairs right next to the arena, or around the other side, again, down a steep incline moving in the road. There is no accessible way to get to SCAN or my office. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a professorial lecturer in American Studies in the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies, where I teach the 2 core courses of the Disability, Health, and Body Certificate, as well as other classes in American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. This information is on the next slide, and I'm also going to drop the link to the certificate in the chat. Thanks, Mac, for doing that. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Disability Plus Faculty and Staff Affinity Group, which we will also link in the chat. Today, I will talk about 2 things. I will start with a discussion of the language we use. I will start with a discussion of the language we use when we talk about disability, because a lot of people are worried about using the wrong words. The second part of my talk will be about my own lived experience. And if you attended my session yesterday, then that might be a good 5 minutes to take a break, because I will repeat much of what I said yesterday. So I have learned most of what I know about disability and access from other disabled, neurodivergent, MAD, or chronically ill folks. I love drawing on the work of Lydia X.C. Brown, that's B-R-O-W-N, to help people better understand what effects our language use around disability has. This information is on the next slide. Lydia Brown teaches classes at AU next to being a disability advocate and activist. I'm going to drop a link to their website in the chat now. Thanks again, Mac, for doing that. We are also going to drop a link for their article titled "The Significance of Semantics, Person-First Language, Why It Matters" in the chat, which I oftentimes use to teach about disability language in my classes. There are basically 2 ways that people oftentimes talk about disability: person-first language and identity-first language. Person-first language is the language you see in a lot of government documents, used by national advocacy organizations, and employed by parents, caregivers, and others working with disabled people. They say, people with disabilities. This language comes out of decades of organizing by parents and caregivers of disabled folks who fought much more discriminatory and hurtful language, which I will not repeat here. These folks had the intention of putting the person first, as they oftentimes explain, in order to highlight their humanity. The second way to describe disability is what we call identity-first language. We say disabled person. This language comes from disabled activists and organizers themselves. The idea is that our disabilities shape us as a person and are an inherent part of our identities and lived experience. We cannot separate ourselves from our disabilities. That doesn't mean we aren't human or worthy. Quite the opposite. We embrace our disabilities and neurodivergence and are proud of it. We refuse the pathologization of disability that always carries in the undertones of person-first language. We say, disability and neurodivergence are nothing to be ashamed about. It is part of who we are. Of course, people are complicated in their identification and language use, and this doesn't mean all disabled people use identity-first language. As we like to say, when you've met one disabled person, you've met one disabled person. None of us represent an entire group of people and their preferences and beliefs. You will encounter plenty of disabled people who prefer person-first language for a myriad of reasons. When I tell my students this, they oftentimes get frustrated. Well, what language am I supposed to use then? I recommend that you always mirror whatever language someone uses about themselves. In other contexts, it is your own ethical decision whether to use person-first or identity-first language. Reading Lydia Brown's short article might help you figure out your own positionality. You could also follow disabled people on social media or visit their web pages to see what language they use. I personally use identity-first language because my neuroqueerness is such an inherent part of who I am, and I am not ashamed of that. Let me explain a couple of relatively new words that people oftentimes confuse: neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and neuroqueerness. This information is on the next slide. I follow Nick Walker for these definitions, whose work can be found on her website, which we will drop in the chat now. Neurodiversity describes the fact that we all have different brains that function differently. There is a diversity of brains, you could say, just like there is a diversity of genders and races and hair textures and body sizes. Neurodivergence describes the fact that some of our brains function differently than the norm. Now, this concept of the norm is of course really problematic. It is socially constructed and can be really harmful when deviance from the norm is pathologized and punished. Neurodivergence describes people who have been labeled as dyslexic, autistic, or as having ADHD, bipolar, borderline, or OCD, for example. Neuroqueer might be the word that is the least familiar to you, and it is a relatively new word. People use neuroqueer in a variety of ways, but for me, neuroqueer means, similar to queer, that I fully embrace my neurodivergence despite how it is pathologized in our culture. It is a linguistic move that signals, I see your stereotypes and prejudices and limited way of imagining what can be a good life, and I simply don't care. It is also an aspirational identification because the daily struggle to embrace a difference that can single you out in many ways is hard. Some days I don't feel very proud of not being able to hear in noisy environments. Some days I don't feel good about not knowing social scripts. Some days I can't bear the hurt of people saying, but you don't seem autistic at all. I also identify as neuroqueer because of how I think about the intersection between gender, sexual orientation, and neurodivergence. I don't want this to become a lecture about my research though, so I'll just say, as someone who identifies as queer, genderqueer, which means I don't identify as either male or female, and I think the whole gender binary is pretty silly and has never made sense to me. And also neuroqueer, so all of these three aspects overlap and inform each other in important and fundamental ways. People who are labeled as autistic are statistically much more likely to identify as genderqueer or non-binary or trans. Gender just doesn't make sense to many of us. Identifying as neuroqueer includes that signal to me as well, which is why I love using the term. A final word about language and identification. I usually help my students think about this by giving them a comparison to other identity-based language use. I ask them, would you describe yourself as a person with Blackness, as a person with gayness, or as a person with Mexicanness? Why then would we use this language constellation for disability? What makes disability so different from other identity categories? And what does our discomfort about disability language say about us? These are questions I would also like to leave you all with today, and maybe in the Q&A we can discuss this further if folks would like. Now, let me move to my second part, in which I want to share a little bit of my own lived experience in the hopes that it will help other faculty and staff who are disabled or neurodivergent. This information is on the next slide. I will be discussing my lived experience, which includes brief mentions of what we label mental illness, including CPTSD, flashbacks, and triggers. Please be gentle with yourselves if this might be hard for you, and feel free to mute me or zone out, or if you're in person, to leave the room during this section. And return in about 5 minutes when I'm done talking about this. Also, as a reminder, if you attended yesterday's panel, you might want to take a 5-minute break anyway, because I'll be repeating myself. So as I just mentioned, I identify as queer, genderqueer, and neuroqueer. But that word, as I said earlier, is still pretty new to a lot of folks. So if you wanted to describe me more traditionally, you might say that I am autistic and that I have depression, anxiety, and CPTSD. While labels can sometimes be helpful, they can also be reductive and harmful, which is why instead of talking about labels, I prefer to talk about my experiences. I make sure my students know that I'm neurodivergent, and depending on the classroom atmosphere, I'm sometimes very frank about my lived experience, and sometimes I'm a bit more cautious. However, since I know how much it means to disabled and neurodivergent students to see that they're not alone and that they too could become professors, I usually try to overcome my fear of sharing too much personal information and try to open up to my students. As someone who is autistic, I have particular access needs, and these access needs are particularly mine. Every autistic person, as Caitlin said earlier, is different. They include needing more gentle lighting that allows my brain to function well, which very few classrooms offer. It also means needing spaces with little to no background noises, or of course being able to wear noise-canceling headphones, but that's not an option when I'm teaching. It means using a blue light filter on my laptop that coincidentally also significantly reduces the glare on the projectors that can be really hard for students as well. It also means I need breaks to be actual rest breaks for my brain and not ongoing conversations with my most invested students. I also need time to find an all-gender restroom, which might not always be close by. None of these access needs usually clash with my students' access needs, and if anything, help them have a better classroom experience. This next part is harder for me to talk about because it goes against the demands of grind culture and the toxic investment in perfectionism, commitment, and dedication in academia. So I hope you can be gentle with what I'm about to share. If you need to step away, this would be a good time, and you could return in about 2 minutes. Sometimes I have rough days and I might not be able to grade as quickly as I usually do, or I can't respond to emails. Very rarely I can't make it to campus. If something comes up that triggers flashbacks, I might need a few minutes or even an hour to regroup. Many of our students struggle with depression and anxiety, and this has only gotten worse, way worse during the pandemic, as I'm sure you have all noticed. Autistic students oftentimes have depression or anxiety or both, partly as a result of the way in which our society harms autistic people and ignores our needs. Disabled people are much more likely than any other group to be survivors of sexual and physical violence. All of this means that my students, just like me, oftentimes struggle in ways we don't make space for in the classroom. My students appreciate my candor when I am struggling, and I return their understanding when they struggle. Everyone benefits from content disclaimers. I usually do not show triggering materials in class because I know the horror of being stuck in your seat and having to suppress or hide a flashback from your classmates, or stumbling out of the room to cry in the bathroom and then have to return eventually to pick up your belongings. I discuss this with my students too, and outline why even their detailed descriptions of incidents could be very hard for someone to process, which is why we stick to the content of our readings so that everyone knows what they are in for when they enter the classroom. My own lived experience has made me more aware of some access barriers that students might be facing, but I have had to learn about many others from colleagues and friends. On my last slide, I have listed some best practices that I follow when I try to create access for myself and my students in the classroom. The first one is a tongue-in-cheek play on my name, so you really don't have to do that. Be accepting, honest, and open, which you can abbreviate to AHO. This means I try to be radically honest with my students and encourage them to do the same. I try to model not just acceptance of disability and difference, but I try to show how much we can all thrive together. I try to always be kind and understanding. I picture myself in the student's position. What if I had a breakdown, couldn't get out of bed for a week, and now had to ask my professor for an extension? How would that feel if I knew I could be totally honest instead of having to make up an excuse? What would that do to my commitment to the class? How would it change my relationship with my professor? Honesty creates trust, and trust creates dedication. Most of my students show up on the last day of class, even though I have no attendance requirements, and even though that last session does not help them with their final project, but simply because we have grown a strong bond over the semester. And those who cannot make it on the last day, email me why and tell me honestly what's going on. Students have gotten so invested that they've asked me to run a book club during breaks because they miss the community of our classrooms. I know that because I care, they care as much as they can, and I do not take it personally when they cannot. My second best practice is about the assumptions we make about our students or colleagues or other people we work with. A few years ago, I read a piece that I can no longer locate, but it argued that we should challenge the basic assumption that people are lazy. What if, instead of thinking of people as lazy, we thought of why some people cannot perform at a level we want them to? This would create not only more empathy, but it would also make us question why we are so invested in particular performances of mastery. Does it really matter if the student knows the contents of the first third of class by Monday or by Friday? Does it really matter if the student submits their paper a week or 3 weeks after the semester ends? We all know the science that if you are cramming for an exam, you will forget almost everything as soon as it is not needed anymore. That is why I build my classes around long-term retention. Shifting away from a short-term focus on immediate performance allows me to be more generous and understanding with my students. Is my kindness sometimes exploited by students who we think don't need flexible deadlines? Maybe. But the amount of students, especially disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent students who have expressed their relief, surprise, and deep gratitude when they finally found a professor who believed them makes that absolutely worth it, in my opinion. Finally, I try to create as much access as possible while keeping my own access needs in mind, which can sometimes be a struggle, and I'd love to talk about that fine balance more in the Q&A if you'd like. There are so many ways of increasing access that I do not have the time to go over here, but I have just started writing a newsletter with access advice called Access Hacks that offers one access strategy a month. If you'd like to sign up for it, we'll drop the link in the chat. You can also find the first post in the latest CTRL beat, which will also drop in the chat. In it, I discuss the importance of discussing access with your students as the basis from where you can build out access, which again, I'd be happy to talk more about in the Q&A. And with that, I'll give it over to Lee. Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't have a slide because I just like to kind of talk openly. I've never really done anything like this, so forgive me if I, make a mistake or something. But yeah, my name is Lee Hanau, Leigh-Hanau, pronounced Hanau. And I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I identify as autistic, and I use the word autistic rather than person with autism, mainly because of the reasons that Professor Aho has just said. Also, it's easier. It's just easier to say that. It's a kind of a mouthful to say person with autism over and over again, so I just kind of use autistic. And I am a junior at American University, and I am a poli-sci major with an art history minor, and I am on my way, and I am working to get a certificate in disability studies, the body's health and disabilities with Professor Aho. So yeah, this is when Professor Aho first asked if anyone with if any autistic students would like to speak here, I was a little nervous, but I decided to, because I always like being frank and open about my autism, and I feel like I bring a different perspective sometimes. I was diagnosed when I was very, very young. My parents noticed I wasn't meeting major milestones, and I got diagnosed very early. So my entire life I've known and was able to get some help. A lot of the help didn't help though. A lot of it wasn't, because autism is so broad. It's hard to find something that fits people exactly. And that is one thing I really want to emphasize. Like Caitlin said earlier, every single autistic person is different, and there is no way you can treat one autistic person exactly like another autistic person. And that is something that I really do believe. So yeah, but to talk about what I need in the classroom, I like a classroom where I can get up, move around, stim, do things with my hands without being judged or without people thinking I am not actively listening. I hate that word, actively listening, because it implies that there is only one way to listen. And if you do not look and behave that way, you are not listening and therefore cannot absorb the material. I think that's not necessarily the best way to encourage people to listen. Because when people talk to me about actively listening, I focus more on looking and pretending and acting in a way that I am listening, but I am not actually retaining the information because I'm focused on trying to look like I'm listening. So I like one where I like an environment where I don't have to make eye contact with the professor. I do not necessarily have to raise my hand for participation points. And I also like one where it was actually funny. I like the room pretty bright so I can see everything because I also have bad vision. So that was a funny thing in Professor Aho's class, because I'd be like, hi, I can't see. And we'd have to turn the lights on and off. But I have pretty bad vision. So that's another one of my access needs. I also have ADHD and some other learning disabilities that impact my writing and my math skills. So trying to balance all of those can get a little difficult. Most of my access needs hinge on those, but the ones that need to do with autism, I definitely prefer to reach out to my professors over email. I don't like having to talk to my professors in person a lot of the time, especially because, I have to make eye contact. I have to actively listen, and it's just very uncomfortable. I get very nervous that I'm going to say something wrong or something's going to come out incorrectly, that they're not going to understand me, because sometimes the way I speak is different than a way a lot of other people speak. So I definitely prefer, if I have a problem, reaching out to them over email. I know a lot of professors don't like that, which is understandable. And that is something I also have to understand, that a lot of professors also have access needs that we need to kind of work out a compromise. So I definitely prefer reaching out to my professors over email. And I definitely like an environment where an inclusive environment. This one can be a little more kind of broad. There's not one way where you can just check off inclusive environment. Because I've had a lot of teachers say that, oh, I foster an inclusive environment. You can say anything you want, but in reality, you can't. You will get judged. And, that's actually Professor Aho's class was one of the only ones where I truly felt like I could discuss with them. And if I had any problems, I was having an issue earlier this semester, and I felt totally comfortable pulling them aside and telling them about my situation and why something might be late or why I might not be able to do something until later. And that was really freeing. And also saying that, oh, I foster an open environment, but actually saying, if you want to stim, if you want to get up and walk around, if you want to lie on the floor. I've never had another teacher or professor say anything like that to me. So it was definitely eye-opening and really, really welcoming when I heard that I was not going to be judged by Professor Aho or my fellow students for, just kind of being myself and doing my thing and not necessarily actively listening, maybe if I'm multitasking. So that's definitely some of my access needs. Of course, I have the standard, extra time on tests, stuff like that. But that's a lot different when you have a learning disability where it's like, oh, you just need some extra time. Cool. Versus autism, where it's a very large and encompassing thing. And I feel like that's something people need to realize, is that autism isn't necessarily like a diagnosis or a disorder. Or even a disability in some sense. It's who I am as a person, and it defines me. And if I didn't have autism, I wouldn't be me. And there's no need to cure or fix it. There's just ways that I learn best, and that ways that can help me learn best. So definitely kind of those things as a student. Also, college life can be difficult for autistic students. There's a lot of resources for children, especially parents of autistic children. But once you become an adult, there are no resources almost for you. You're kind of left out in the dust. And it's almost as if once you become an adult, you will stop having autism, which is absolutely not the case. In fact, I felt my autism more strongly ever since I became an adult than I was when I was a child. So being an adult and doing kind of what I call real human activities and things in the world can be very difficult when you're trying to balance your school life and your regular person, doing chores, going running errands, stuff like that. It's really hard to do that a lot of the time. And I feel like a lot of professors don't think about that, or only professors who teach freshmen might think about how difficult the transition is. But honestly, it's been difficult all 3 years. I'm going to be very candid. And I feel like when professors of autistic students kind of need to think about how it's it might be more difficult for someone with autism to have a separate school life and home life checklist. So yeah, sorry if I rambled a little bit. I definitely really appreciate being here, and that's kind of what I have to say. So thank you.
Are there any questions?
Would it be possible to get, yeah, great. Me and Lee together on the screen. Yeah, if we don't have questions in the room right now, we do have a couple of them in the Google Docs, so we could start with those. Caitlin, I can't see anyone in the room, so if people raise their hand to ask questions, you'll have to let me know, okay?
I'll let you know. Oh, we do have questions. Do you want to begin with the questions in the room?
Sure, let's start with those.
Okay.
Can you all make sure to revoice them so we can hear them?
Yeah, I just want to preface, if you're asking a question, maybe speak up a little bit, just because this picks up on this noise up here really well, but not as much. Yeah.
Good morning. First, I want to thank you so much. This session has been incredibly helpful to me, and I really appreciate your authenticity and also your bravery to speak so candidly in this space. And I was really interested, and I'm in the School of Education, and I think a lot about the kinds of supports that are in K-12 systems that we don't have as much in higher education. And for the last speaker, who is a current student, who mentioned this problem, that in college, we don't have as many supports as the K-12 systems. I was wondering if you could talk about the supports that you had in the K-12 system that you wish you currently had. I would love to hear about that from your perspective.
Definitely. Thank you for asking. I had a lot of different supports and I tried a lot of different things in K through 12, but definitely the one that helped me the most was I went to a high school that was very helpful. And they had this thing called, that was in my IEP, my individualized education plan, that was called skills classes. There were like skills, which was almost like a kind of personal tutoring, but there was definitely like a more of a, what do you call it? Like a, not incentive, but like you kind of felt like you not had to go, but it was on your schedule. So it was very much like, oh, they're going to be checking attendance, you better be there kind of thing, which I personally felt was really helpful because a lot of the times I might have been tempted to skip it, honestly, and like do something else. But in those classes, there would be like an individual one for math that I would go to with my actual like a pre-calc teacher who would do a little lesson with me and some other people where he would like pre-teach or he would go help us with the confusing homework. And I thought that was really helpful. And there was also one called study skills where it was basically just you and you would get you and some other kids and your teacher. And you would get to know each other all really well. And there it was based definitely help with the home school balance thing. They would help you keep track of your classes. They would help you basically like do your homework, and they would really kind of keep you accountable. And I feel like a lot of the times, like you may have an advisor, but personal accountability about like what you are doing in this moment is a little, you know, that's not something you can really get in college, which I understand, you know, there's no like incentive. There's like, it's a little less, it's more like you have to go do it yourself, which may make me sound lazy, but I definitely need a little push sometimes from people to get things done. It's definitely a little difficult for me. And so something like that, especially with me building a personal relationship with someone is so important if they want to help me. A lot of the times, like, I don't really know my advisors at AU very well. My advisor just kind of left halfway throughout the year, and now I have a new one that I've never met. And like, no offense to them, that's, you know, that's just the way it works. But sometimes it feels difficult to reach out to someone you barely know. So definitely just kind of the personal community environment is definitely something I feel is missing for the autistic community at AU. So yeah, that's definitely the type of resources that I liked in K through 12. I don't know how possible it is to implement something like that now. It's probably impossible, but that's just what I liked. Then again, not all autistic people like that. So yeah, just kind of keep that in mind.
Thank you so much.
Person over in the back, please.
Thank you both for the presentation. Let me know if you can hear me okay or if I should speak up. Okay, I'll speak louder. So I know there's a lot of anxiety among instructors about how can we make things accessible when there's so much neurodiversity and everyone needs something different. I think there are different solutions to this, but I'm wondering what you all suggest to sort of help instructors feel like they can address the difference in the class without feeling like, oh, I can't please everyone, for example.
Thank you. And could I ask real quick, would you introduce yourself with your name, because we can't see the audience, so we don't actually know who we're talking to at all.
My name is Sheb, like the thing in your backyard, and I'm a teaching consultant at the CTRL. And I go by they or she.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So that I think is a concern that so many people share, right? How do I provide access? I want to make things as accessible as possible, but I only know a limited amount. And there are also opposing access needs. And I really liked the example Lee gave of our classroom where some people wanted the lights dimmed and other people needed the lights as bright as possible, right? And I think it's a really good example because it shows that creating access is all about having a conversation and building community, right? Because what we had to do is we had to check in with each other about our access needs, and then we had to have a conversation. Okay, how do we make this possible so that people who need dimmer lights can still feel okay in this environment, but that people who have certain vision needs also have those fulfilled, right? What is the compromise we can come to? And so when I think about different access needs in the classroom, I just think a lot about, you know, providing flexibility as much as possible within what is possible for me, because oftentimes when I think about flexibility, whether that's the modality of, for example, how I'm testing learning outcomes, right? I, for example, offer a written midterm, but I usually give students the chance to also do an oral exam. However, if I have 80 students, then I can't provide everyone the option of also doing an oral exam, right? I just physically don't have the capacity to do that as one person. So that goes back to the question of resources, which Lee also pointed to a little bit in her previous comment at the end, that we oftentimes don't have the resources on campus to make certain things happen for students, right? I got to AU in 2018, and I've been trying to build neurodivergent and disability community on campus ever since, but I'm doing it on top of my regular day job. And we don't have somebody who's getting paid right now to do that kind of work. And so when resources are missing, oftentimes it means we have to limit the amount of flexibility that we provide to students. There are also ways in which the university officially limits flexibility. For example, by having this 72-hour grading turnaround at the end of the semester, which I think is completely disableist, right? It actively discriminates against disabled people, disabled and neurodivergent faculty, but also people with care responsibilities, right? And people who have all kinds of things going on in their lives where they can't just grade 80 exams in 72 hours, counting the weekend, by the way. But so that flexibility might be circumscribed. Right, currently AU is disencouraging faculty from providing hybrid options for classrooms. I have found, and I do this in all my classrooms where I'm able to, that I always record my classes and I run a Zoom at the same time so that students who for whatever reason cannot attend in person can attend online. It means a lot more students show up to class even when they're sick or struggling, when they can't make it out of their room that day, when they have other care responsibilities, right? They can also asynchronously watch the recording afterwards. It takes 30 seconds to know, once you know what cables you have to plug in, it takes 30 seconds to set it up. It's not a big deal, you know, it really doesn't impact me much at all. But because AU is actively discouraging it, I know a lot of folks who are not doing it because of that, right? And nobody is sharing out the skills in how do we actually learn and know how to do this. And so I think that's something important to think about as well. But to answer your question, to me, right, it's every day you can learn a new access skill, or every week you can learn a new access skill. I'm constantly learning new access things. I just learned how to make those QR codes at a recent conference I went to. I think they're awesome. I had no idea it was so easy. It's like one little thing you have to click and then it generates the QR code. But it's a process. It's a process that's ongoing. But most importantly, you need to communicate with the people that you're building an accessible space with, right? You need to have a conversation, and then you have to learn together and from each other. That's one of the best things I have learned from what we call CRIP community, from being with other disabled people, is that we're always learning together how to do things better. And as long as you keep those channels of communication open, even if from the beginning you don't know how to make everything accessible, even if you don't know how to do all the different access things, you can develop that slowly together. And I think that process is actually almost more important than providing the quote unquote perfect accessible space from the get-go, because it shows everyone, it builds skills in the process for everyone, right? And it makes everyone realize that access is not something that one person provides for another person, but it's something we do for each other. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
I just want to bring attention to Miss Nay, who is in the Zoom call. They have their hand risen.
Hello, my name is Miss Nay, my name is Nay, N-A-E, I almost forgot. And I work with university conferences and guest services. I am here because we do trainings for students, and I would like our training to be more accommodating or understanding of everyone's different learning styles. Last year, I did incorporate different hands-on things, but I realized that's not exactly enough. And so my question was kind of similar to what the prior person asked, just trying to understand how to accommodate everyone's styles or needs. But I have a second part to that. What if, because we're doing training for students and it's a job, we don't always get those knowledge of this student has this accommodation needs, or that's not always given to us. So what I would like to know or understand how I can, maybe I can, if I have to work with the office on campus, or if we can create some type of maybe questionnaire for a student to say, if you have needs, let us encourage the students to be open enough to let us know, because I'm thinking about one thing I know is important. We got to get smaller sessions. Our sessions had 60 students. That was overwhelming for me. So that was something I want to bring in, and I'm pushing hard. And so, yeah, so that's my statement. And just the second part to that, I grew up with a brother who had Down syndrome. He was my oldest brother. So I was involved in the Special Olympics for a very long time. I'm still an active volunteer. I know that this has led me to have a different type of compassion and understanding for a variety of humans, regardless of their needs. And I am sad to know that AU is not more instrumental in realizing everyone's needs. And I think that this session would be so useful to be a requirement, just to have that full understanding. So thank you all for today.
Thank you. Caitlin, do you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in first?
I would just add to do research online, check the links of the organizations I mentioned. The Association of University Centers on Disabilities have resources about different issues facing people with disabilities. So yes, I would recommend doing a lot of research online, check in the campus library.
Lee, do you want to follow up on that, or should I go first?
Do you mind if you go first? I just need a few minutes to think.
Yeah, totally. Because I was thinking, if you can mull it over, it'd be great to hear the student perspective, but I'll go first. So thank you for the question. I think that's a really wonderful way to think about, what can I do, like really practically, what can I do in order to accommodate different learning styles, and maybe even to think about how I can create more access for students who either haven't disclosed their access needs or might not understand their own access needs, right? This is something I do in the beginning of each of my classes in the beginning of the semester. No matter what the class is on, I dedicate the first session to talking about disability and access, because oftentimes there are students who did not have the privilege of being diagnosed or understanding themselves early on as disabled, neurodivergent, chronically ill, or MAD, right? And so I might be able as a faculty member to see that they might have a learning disability, or that, there might be other things going on. I'm obviously not someone who professionally labels people. And so I don't ever go up to students and say, hey, I think you might be part of our autistic club, right? But I can see that there are students who could really benefit from different kinds of forms of access in the classroom, and they might not know that about themselves. So one of the things I do at the beginning of every semester, and I'm going to drop this in the chat, I know it's not helpful for the folks in the room, but I have a form, an anonymous form that I send out in the beginning of the semester before the class starts that asks students about a couple of different things, including access needs. The form is important to me, and I'm happy if you just want to email me, I'll send that out to people in the room. My email again is aho@american.edu. But the form signals to students, I'm interested in you as a person, right? I care about what your access needs are, and I want to know how you're doing. And it already starts building community even before we've come into the physical classroom together, or the Zoom classroom, whatever it is. And in it, I ask them just a couple of questions. It's not too long, so it's not overwhelming, but I ask them how they feel about returning to campus or being back in physical classrooms or Zoom classrooms. I ask them about what their access needs are. I also explain what that means. I ask them, what will help you flourish in our classroom? And I give them examples, right? Are distracting sounds difficult? Do you not work well under time pressure? Are you comfortable or not comfortable speaking in front of groups, right? Do you feel nauseous or weak or tired? Do you get brain fog or pain or migraines? I give them a number of examples so that even if they don't think of themselves as disabled, neurodivergent, chronically ill, or mad, they can see, oh yeah, this is my lived experience. Yeah, I get really anxious before I walk into a classroom. I didn't realize that's something I share with a lot of other people, and there are things we can do to make that easier for you. I also asked them about how their break went and what their workload is going to be, because that too is going to impact, of course, the way in which they inhabit the classroom space and how they can show up for the class. And so I think you could either send that out earlier before those students come to be trained. If that doesn't work, if you can't get their contact information, you could also think about doing, and it's anonymous, you could think about doing an anonymous way of giving feedback in the beginning of the training session, right? Whether it is note cards, an online anonymous form, or some other way in which students could provide that kind of information. But I find that those conversations can be more helpful when students actually understand the breadth of what can constitute access, because oftentimes it is hard for us to imagine that which we have never been given. Lee, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, even if, it can be daunting or overwhelming, but even if you can't logistically for whatever reason, give people the support or access needs, asking them and letting them tell you is so important. I cannot tell you how much more validated and seen I feel than when my professor sends out the survey at the beginning of the year and asks you about access needs. That already puts such trust in me that the professor actually cares, not just about my needs and services I might need to receive, but they care about me as a person and my well-being. And that makes me feel so much more comfortable already. And even if for whatever reason they can't meet all of my access needs, the fact that they care enough to ask and try to work something out means a lot to me. So I think that's just really something in mind. I feel like a lot of people get overwhelmed with they don't know exactly what to do, or they get nervous that they can't provide everyone what they need. But honestly, just showing you care and trying as hard as you can to get it done really means so much. So that's kind of really what I think. So yeah.
We had a question or a hand raised from Professor Mike.
Michael Baron, Mathematics and Statistics. Want to say this is a great session, very well organized, and it's a great support for our autism community. Katie, you mentioned that you contacted the US Census Bureau about the data on autism, and they said they had none. So the agency that collects data on all various groups of people had nothing on autism, tells me that it doesn't get enough support on the national scale. As far as employment or unemployment of people with autism, Caitlin mentioned in her promotion advertisement of this session that people with autism form the most vulnerable group, so it should receive attention. With as far as unemployment data, I have more hopes with BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They should collect the data on employment. And I know I promised I will follow up. We have great connection with Erika Groschen, the former director of BLS and the former national commissioner for labor statistics. I will definitely ask if she has any leads to the data. And another possible source, we had what's her name? Clarissa Eason, our science librarian from Vendor Library, was willing to help us finding the data, and she said there is a specifically designated data science librarian in our library who can search and probably find the data, because I'll be very interested in you continuing this research, and I will be willing to help you with statistics. So I think we should continue providing this support and doing research on autism.
Thank you. I propose that there should be a national model for collecting the data and disseminating that. And maybe that could come through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. State VRs might have data, but to mold it into a national project would take time, involve a lot of work, but I think it would be a really worthwhile project. Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Just, well, first of all, thank you very much for this presentation. You were all wonderful, very enlightening, took out copious notes. I have kind of a nuts and bolts question about the classroom. The university does not permit me to reduce the volume of work that I assign to all students. And I've had many instances in which I have had students who are probably on the spectrum and have learning disabilities and qualify for accommodations, but they can't produce the same volume of work sometimes that other students can at the same rate. And there are many reasons for that, I'm sure. And they may turn in a few papers and they're excellent, but they don't turn in the third one. And then, of course, they're failing the course. And it breaks my heart because I have seen students drop out of college even because they can't keep up with that volume that they're expected to produce. I've tried different things, maybe providing the assignment in a different manner or something, but the university does not allow me to reduce the volume. And it's something that I've always been struggling with, and I'm wondering if you have any recommendations as to how we can give these students access and make them successful, because I know they're very capable. It's just that they work differently than other students.
I can talk from my experience as a when I was a student. I took, and I don't recommend this, but I will tell you what I did so I could do the work. I took a reduced course load. It extended the years that I would be in college, 5 years instead of 4, but I took a reduced course load, and that helped a lot.
Yeah, this is Tanya. I'm also happy to chime in on this. I completely understand that struggle. I go through that every semester with students, and it's heartbreaking when you care about them and you see that they are very invested in the course and that they, you know, if you could change these structural barriers that the university is putting in place, then they would flourish, right? So I have one question, which is when you say the university won't let you, my question is, who is actually enforcing that? And is that true, right? Because I have seen a lot of faculty demand very different forms of work and amounts of work from students for even similar classes. So, so this is sort of a, don't make it official hack, which I obviously feel nervous about saying on a recorded session in front of all of you. I don't even know who's in the room. But that's one question I have actually started to ask myself more and more. I started out as a professorial lecturer on a 1-year contract, and I was not going to go against any sort of rules because I didn't know if I was going to get renewed, right? So depending on what your position is, you might feel more comfortable making different choices about the amount of assignments based on that. So I think that's a general structural problem that we should be talking more about. What I do as a workaround for now is I offer students incompletes. And I know not every student can take an incomplete depending on their financial aid situation, but I offer them incompletes quite generously. I still demand that they've completed at least a certain amount of work in the class. Usually that also says something about whether they'll actually end up doing more work or not. But I try to be relatively generous with that. And oftentimes students don't even know that there is an option to take an incomplete because other professors don't tell them about it. And that usually helps those students who just need maybe an extra month to produce that third essay. I wish I had better advice, but that's all I've figured out what to do for now. But if there are other folks in the room, I also do want to note that I think we're over time. So if anybody needs to leave or log off, that's of course you're very welcome to. I'm happy to stay on and talk more because there are still other questions. But for anybody who needs to leave, we of course understand. Yeah. Caitlin, are there other questions in the room?
Oh, those are not.
I think we had one more question in the Google Doc.
Okay, I'll stay.
And
I have one more question if allowed.
Yes, sorry, I didn't hear who just said that. Oh, okay, Nay, go ahead.
I just have one more question, and I do want to ask for understanding in me asking this because as I think about it, it sounds a bit much. Is there ever a job? So I'm thinking about our training, the requirements of the duties of our job and having to do customer service and be in front of people. Is there ever a position that someone may not be able to handle? And I know the answer is yes, but then again, I don't know the answer is yes. So with somebody with just very limited things, like one of the requirements that we expect is when they're sitting at the desk in the residence hall, that they turn on the lights. And now I'm thinking about what you two have said. And it's like, as soon as I go in there, I'm like, your light's not on. And I'm like, oh man, right? So can our job be limiting and then we still accommodate people because the requirement is the lights are on because it's a front desk, people are coming up. But dang, that may be somebody's issue. I mean, concern, or I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think just the fact that you're thinking about that now is so important, right? And one of the things that learning more about access has helped me do is to reconsider so many things that I used to require. I used to require attendance. I used to not allow laptops in classrooms, that now in hindsight, I'm just shocked by my former self, right? Because that would single out students who had accommodations and needed to use their laptops. And so I think the important question to ask is, why is that requirement there, right? And then is there space for compromise or negotiation? So in my office, for example, you can see that I have disabled the overhead lights, and I used to share my office with someone. And so we figured, and they needed the overhead lights. So we figured out a schedule that we wouldn't be in the room at the same time so that she could have the overhead lights on while when I was in the room, I kept them off, right? And I brought my own lamps in because I don't officially have accommodations through AU, so I had to pay for those lamps myself. But that's fine. So, but I think a lot about with the questions that you asked about jobs I used to have. And I mean, sometimes people are able to push themselves past what they're comfortable with. But then, for example, for a lot of autistic folks, that can lead to a sort of shutdown state where I can force myself to socialize for 5 or 6 hours. And then afterwards, I have to sit in like a quiet, dark, tiny room, to like decompress and get out of that and work through those feelings. And so I think for each step of the way, you know, when you're thinking about students doing front desk work, right? Some people might have a really hard time answering the phone. Some people might have a really hard time with emergency situations, attending to someone if they have like CPTSD, right? Like everybody will have different, and I know if you're training so many people, the problem again is resources, right? If there would be 5 of you who could train smaller groups of students and who could build more intimate relationships with them, you could get to know them better and know what kinds of access needs they have and then work around that. But again, it oftentimes comes down to that question of, well, if we don't have the people power, if we don't have enough staff that get hired by AU, they don't get paid enough, so they don't stick around, right? They're not treated well. How much can we actually do with the energy and time that we do have available? And so it is a balancing act at the end of the day, right? And you can do as much as you can, but you also have to be okay with and accept the fact that there are things that you know would provide more access, but you simply can't do because you're just one person, or because there are certain requirements or certain time limitations for what you're doing. But I just want to say, I think it's so wonderful that you're even just thinking about all these questions now. I think that'll make a really big difference.
I'm going to ask us to wrap up because we have more things going on. Thank you all so much. Alice,
Thank
will
you.
close out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And please feel free to follow up with emails if you have any other questions.